Hello, welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for joining us today, however you're joining us. If it's through the podcast or if you're watching on YouTube right now, hello. If you haven't already, please do subscribe on either your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. If you are on YouTube, please also like this video. Also, if you haven't, please do subscribe to our newsletter. It comes out weekly every Wednesday. It talks about current events and relates it back to different episodes that we've done and really offers a nice way to kind of tie everything together. Please also do follow us on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast and on Twitter at Politics People Pod. That's Politics PPLPOD. And as always, please do check out our Patreon page. You can find all of our episodes there, as well as transcripts for all of the episodes, some extra content, especially, of course, if you are a patron. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can check out the different tiers that we have, and thank you so much for supporting the show. This episode was originally going to be about the First Amendment in general, and I do say First Amendment a lot, but it kind of just ended up being about freedom of speech. So I think what we're going to do is have this one be about freedom of speech, and then in the future we'll look at the other aspects of the First Amendment. Okay, so getting to today's topic. With everything that's been going on lately, you hear the First Amendment thrown around a lot. Oh, First Amendment, the protections that we have, that it offers us, that it guarantees us. The main one being freedom of speech, especially with social media platforms suspending or banning individuals or groups, of course, notably President Trump, and QAnon members as well. The conversation has kind of shifted to the First Amendment as this catch-all idea of, oh, we can say whatever we want, we can do whatever we want, it doesn't seem to matter because we can just hold up this flag of the First Amendment and we're good to go, right? So I wanted to cover the First Amendment because I don't think a lot of people know what the First Amendment is, what the First Amendment says, and really what the First Amendment does. Because you may be surprised to learn, or not surprised, it doesn't protect anything and everything. It is not a catch-all, and that's not what it was intended to be. So, without further ado, let's take a look at it. So the first thing in talking about the First Amendment is I wanted to actually introduce you to the First Amendment. I wanted to actually take a minute and just read it to you real quick. You may be surprised to know that it's only 45 words long. That's it. And really, the entire Constitution isn't that long. I mean, look at this book. That's it. And that's the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, with notes for both, including all of the amendments. These aren't incredibly long documents, so as I do say often here on the podcast, please go and check it out for yourself. Give it a read. I promise it won't take you that long. So, Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's it. So if the First Amendment is so short, why does it have so much power? Why do we give it so much power? The first thing I want to say about the First Amendment is it does have a lot of power. It does have a lot of weight, and for very good reason. If you think about where our country came from, what the Founding Fathers fought the Revolutionary War against, they did not want to risk our government becoming a monarchy or any form of government with one figurehead that is all-powerful and immune from dissent. Now, that of course doesn't mean you get to say whatever you want. What it means is that the government isn't allowed to jail or fine people based on what they say, except in exceptional circumstances. It doesn't mean that private organizations or individuals can't limit or have restraints on what you say. So, with that, what is protected? Really, if you think about it, it's pretty much basic things are protected that you would expect to be protected in this country, and anything content-based. So the government isn't allowed to put regulations, for the most part, on what you actually say. So what is protected? Think about not engaging in customary acts. Like, they can't pass a law forcing you to say the Pledge of Allegiance or to salute the flag. Symbolic speech. Think about in the 60s when students wore black armbands to school in protest of the Vietnam War. Or, and this is a dicey one for a lot of people, campaign contributions. But more on that later. So what is not protected by the First Amendment? Really, that's dealt with on a case-by-case basis. It's difficult to say, kind of in large swaths, what is not protected. If you think, as I mentioned before, in the 60s, the school armbands, that's protected. But student-run newspapers that are school-sponsored are not allowed to say just whatever they want. Schools do have editorial control over what is published in their school-sponsored newspaper. And then there are some kind of basic common sense things that are not allowed and are not protected by the First Amendment. Think about yelling fire in a crowded theater to cause a panic. Something like that is not protected by the First Amendment. Another thing that's not protected by the First Amendment are institutional prohibitions, which tend to carry the caveat of within reason. So what are institutional prohibitions? As I mentioned before, in the 60s, students would wear black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. That is protected. What is not protected is, say, a school-sponsored newspaper publishing whatever the students wanted to publish. The schools do retain editorial control, and whatever you want to say is not necessarily protected by the First Amendment. So, how do we know what is protected under the First Amendment? Generally speaking, content-based restrictions are deemed unconstitutional. And there's a very important reason for that. It's so that the government can't decide what ideas the population as a whole is allowed to hear. Now, there are 3 important exceptions to that. The first is low-value speech, is how it's come to be referred to. And these are kind of baser things. I think that's where they mean, where they get low from. If you think about defamation, threats, pornography, that's what gets lumped together as low-value speech. The next is governmental relationships. So a government employee with access to classified information, there can be prohibitions on whether or not they are allowed to share that information. And this category also encompasses public school students, presumably because those institutions are funded by the government. And the last important exception is when it's done regardless of content. So think about things like noise violations or blocking traffic. They don't care what the noise is or what's in the way. You're just not allowed to do it. And this is kind of a weird thing, but it really is handled on a case-by-case basis because everything has to be deemed reasonable. And what's deemed reasonable can vary. Some things which are notably unreasonable include demonstrating in public parks or handing out leaflets on public streets. You're allowed to do those things. Those are unreasonable to be restricted. So the last important thing to talk about, obviously, with everything that's going on right now, is how does all of this apply to the First Amendment? Or how does the First Amendment apply to all of this? The first big one I think we have to talk about is Twitter. And Twitter is a surprisingly easy one. No. The First Amendment doesn't cover what happens on Twitter. And it doesn't ensure that you get to say whatever you want on Twitter, and they can't stop you. Twitter is a private entity, and as we've discussed in this episode, the First Amendment applies to government regulation. Government can't restrict what you say, with the exceptions that we talked about. But Twitter is a private company. Private companies and private individuals, as we said, have regulatory powers over their platforms or their companies or whatever it is. So if you violate their code of conduct or their terms and conditions, which you have to agree to use the app, then you violate them. And they get to punish you within reason as they see fit. And if that means suspending your account, that's what happens. One of the more interesting places where we can talk about application of the First Amendment is money. There's a lot more of a conversation there. And everybody always says they want to get money out of politics. That's a popular thing to say right now. But what does it actually mean, and does the First Amendment have anything to say about it? Surprisingly, they actually do. So when the Supreme Court first ruled on political contributions, they really left the door open, and they said, yes, this money is free speech, but it can be regulated if the government has sufficient justification, which was later presented, and in a couple of different Supreme Court cases through the years, there were limits put on how much an individual could donate to a political campaign, and then how much a corporation could donate. And then you hear all the time people like Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders talk about Citizens United. Citizens United was one of those cases that really stripped away the limitations and the regulatory power that had been put on and imposed on political campaign contributions by previous Supreme Court rulings. So part of the difficulty seems to be, how do we know what's covered if what's covered seems to change with the Supreme Court justices? And this is an idea that's come into play more with that idea that we talked about before of low-value speech. Low-value speech used to have a pretty wide berth on the Supreme Court. Justices would kind of use it to refer to different things as they saw fit and use it how they wanted it. Over the years, it's gotten to be a much more narrow view for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, as I was just talking about, it limits justices' ability to redefine the term. And it means that every new appointment to the Supreme Court doesn't mean a new reading of the First Amendment. But because that view is so narrow, and it makes it more difficult for justices to change the view, that means that certain types of speech, which might not be as popular right now, remain protected, like hate speech. So what I'd love for you to do, now that we've finished this conversation, is let me know down in the comments what's one thing that you learned, or head over to our Instagram or Twitter and let us know one thing that you learned from this episode. I myself learned a lot about that whole low-value speech thing. I didn't really understand that fully. I kind of had some idea, but I learned a lot more about it researching for this episode. So what's something you learned about? As always, thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, please like the video. And please head over to all of our social media accounts. Check out our Patreon page, even if you're not necessarily going to become a patron, although we hope that you do. And thank you for supporting the show. Stay safe, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Take care.